In the Pacific Northwest of 1981, deep in the forested hills of Grays Harbor County, Washington, nearly 5,000 men worked around the clock. Concrete trucks poured endlessly. Cranes swung steel beams against a gray sky. Two cooling towers rose from the earth like monuments to an energy future that seemed inevitable. The air smelled of diesel and fresh cement. Somewhere in the chaos, welders connected pipes that would carry water heated to 500 degrees. Somewhere else, engineers reviewed blueprints for containment domes designed to withstand a direct aircraft strike. This was the Satsop nuclear power plant, Washington Nuclear Projects 3 and 5, the twin hearts of the most ambitious energy program in American history. The cooling towers already stood 496 feet tall. The reactor building stretched 280 feet high. The turbine hall covered 300,000 square feet. Every month, WPPSS issued $200 million in new bonds. Every month, the project moved 2% closer to completion. Every month, the managers assured the public that clean, abundant nuclear electricity would soon flow to homes across the Pacific Northwest. But there was a number the public did not see, a number that grew faster than the concrete could cure. The original cost estimate for 5 nuclear plants, $4.1 billion. The current estimate, $24 billion and climbing. An increase of nearly 500% in less than a decade, and the plants still were not finished. The Washington public power supply system promised cheap electricity forever. They spent billions of other people's money building monuments to atomic optimism. They never generated a single watt of commercial power at Satsop, not one. Was this the greatest infrastructure failure in American history? Or simply what happens when bureaucrats without experience attempt to build the most complex technology ever invented? Was it corporate negligence, political cowardice, or just the inevitable consequence of hubris meeting inflation? The story of Satsop begins not in Washington state, but in Washington, D.C. It begins in the 1950s, when America looked at the mushroom cloud and saw not destruction, but possibility. The Atomic Energy Commission told the nation that nuclear fission would transform civilization. Electricity would become too cheap to meter. The same force that leveled Hiroshima would power factories, heat homes, light cities. The atom would be tamed, domesticated, put to work for peaceful purposes. In the Pacific Northwest, this promise carried particular weight. The region had grown accustomed to cheap power from federal dams on the Columbia River. The Bonneville Power Administration sold hydroelectric energy at rates that made the rest of the country envious. Industries relocated. Aluminum smelters hummed. The future seemed bright, and it was powered by falling water. But planners in the 1960s saw trouble ahead. Demand projections showed electricity consumption doubling every 10 years. The best dam sites had already been exploited. Environmental movements were blocking new hydroelectric projects. Something would have to replace the rivers. Nuclear power was the obvious answer. Clean, modern, virtually unlimited. The federal government was already operating reactors at Hanford, the sprawling military reservation in southeastern Washington, where plutonium for atomic weapons had been produced since the Manhattan Project. Why not build commercial plants there too? In 1957, the Washington State Legislature authorized the creation of a new entity, the Washington Public Power Supply System, WPPSS, a municipal corporation that would allow publicly owned utilities to combine resources and build power generation facilities together. A consortium of small-town electric cooperatives pooling their purchasing power to secure the energy future of the entire region. The organization started modestly. 17 utilities signed on. They built a small hydroelectric plant at Packwood Lake. It came in 25% over budget, but nobody worried much. These were minor growing pains. The big projects were still to come. Neil Strand took over as managing director of WPPSS in 1973. He was the first leader of the organization with actual nuclear experience. He had worked at the Atomic Energy Commission. He understood reactor design. He spoke the language of neutron flux and containment integrity. Strand looked at the demand forecasts and saw an energy crisis approaching. The Arab oil embargo that autumn only confirmed his fears. Within months, WPPSS announced plans to build not 1, not 2, but 5 nuclear reactors. 3 would be located at Hanford, alongside the military facilities. 2 more would rise at a site called Satsop, near the small town of Elma in Grays Harbor County. The Satsop site made sense for several reasons. Grays Harbor County was economically depressed. The timber industry was declining. Jobs were scarce. Local opposition to nuclear power would be minimal because people were hungry for work. It was, as one official later put it, a win-win situation. The county had once thrived on logging. The forests of the Olympic Peninsula had seemed inexhaustible, and sawmills lined the shores of Grays Harbor. But by the 1970s, the easy timber was gone. Environmental regulations protected what remained. Mills closed. Young people left for Seattle or Portland. The towns of Aberdeen, Hoquiam, and Elma watched their populations shrink and their storefronts empty. When WPPSS announced plans to build 2 nuclear reactors nearby, local leaders saw salvation. The construction phase alone would employ thousands: welders, pipe fitters, electricians, concrete workers, crane operators. All would find steady work at wages far above what the timber industry had paid. Hotels and restaurants would fill with contractors from across the country. Tax revenues would swell. The county that had been left behind by the modern economy would suddenly be at the forefront of the energy future. Local workers were hired in large numbers. They learned new skills, obtained certifications, joined unions. Some had never worked on anything larger than a residential construction project. Now they were building structures designed to contain forces that could level cities. The pride was real. These men believed they were constructing something important, something that would outlast them, something that would power their children's homes. Their families moved into new houses. Their wives found jobs supporting the construction workforce. Their children attended schools suddenly flush with property tax revenue. For a brief, shining moment, Grays Harbor County believed it had found its future. The original plan called for plants 1, 2, and 3 to be financed through a mechanism called net billing. Under this arrangement, public utilities in the region would assign their shares of the plant's output to the Bonneville Power Administration. In return, Bonneville would credit the utilities' power bills for the amounts they owed WPPSS. It was a clever structure that essentially made the federal government the guarantor of the debt. But the Internal Revenue Service intervened. In 1973, they ruled that bonds issued for future net-billed facilities would not be tax-exempt. Without tax-exempt status, the cost of borrowing would increase dramatically. The financing model that worked for the first 3 plants would not work for plants 4 and 5. WPPSS needed a new approach. They found one that seemed elegant at the time, but would prove catastrophic. Plants 4 and 5 would be financed differently. Instead of federal backing, a consortium of 88 public utilities across the Pacific Northwest would sign contracts promising to pay for their share of the construction costs, whether the plants were ever completed or not. These were called take-or-pay contracts, hell or high water agreements. The participating utilities pledged to make payments regardless of circumstances. If the plants were abandoned, the utilities would still owe the money. If costs doubled, the utilities would pay the difference. Wall Street loved it. The bonds received AAA ratings. Institutional investors lined up to purchase them. The interest rates were attractive. The security seemed ironclad. Who could imagine that 88 utilities would all default simultaneously? By the end of the 1970s, WPPSS had become the largest municipal borrower in the United States. They were issuing $200 million in new bonds every 90 days. The money flowed like the Columbia River itself. The decision to build plants 4 and 5 as twins of plants 1 and 3 seemed logical. The theory was simple. Design one plant, build it twice. The experience and resources from the first construction would benefit the second. Costs would be shared. Efficiencies would be realized. WPPSS estimated they would save $400 million through twinning. But there was a problem that defied all logic. When construction began, WPPSS made the confounding decision to build the twin plants differently. At Satsop, WNP3 and WNP5 were designed as 180-degree mirror images of each other. No part from one plant could be used in the other. Every component had to be sorted, labeled, tracked separately. The record-keeping alone became a nightmare. Why would anyone design twins that were not actually identical? The explanations varied. Some said it was a misunderstanding of what twinning meant. Others blamed different contractors working on each reactor. Still others pointed to constant design changes that made consistency impossible. Workers on the site sometimes installed equipment in the wrong building. Parts intended for WNP3 ended up at WNP5. Quality control inspectors could not keep track of which specifications applied to which reactor. The supposed savings from twinning evaporated. The supposed efficiencies became inefficiencies. Construction at Satsop began in 1977. WPPSS had applied for permits in 1973, but regulatory reviews, environmental impact statements, and design modifications had consumed 4 years before the first shovel broke ground. The site itself was impressive. 1,600 acres of forested hillside overlooking the Satsop River. The cooling towers would be visible for miles, rising above the Douglas firs and western red cedars. Each cooling tower would stand 496 feet tall, with a base 440 feet wide. They were designed to release steam into the Pacific Northwest sky, cooling the water that had absorbed heat from the reactor cores. The reactor buildings were equally massive. The main circular structure for WNP3 would be 280 feet tall and 160 feet across, with 20,000 square feet of interior volume. A 250-ton overhead crane would move equipment and fuel assemblies. The walls were being constructed from reinforced concrete nearly 10 feet thick, designed to withstand a magnitude 10 earthquake, a direct impact from a commercial aircraft, and the pressure of a catastrophic reactor accident. These specifications reflected the regulatory environment of the late 1970s. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission had been steadily tightening safety requirements since its creation in 1975. Every plant under construction faced new mandates, new reviews, new modifications. The contractor relationships at WPPSS illustrated many of the management problems that plagued the project. Multiple contractors worked simultaneously on the 5 nuclear plants, each with their own interests, schedules, and priorities. Coordinating their activities required management capabilities that WPPSS simply did not possess. Ebasco served as architect-engineer for the Satsop plants. They were supposed to design the facilities and oversee construction. When problems became severe in 1980, Ebasco brought in a new management team that improved performance significantly. Bechtel was appointed construction manager for the Hanford plants. They brought experience from nuclear projects across the country, but even their expertise could not overcome the fundamental problems with schedule, budget, and regulatory compliance. The contractors often blamed each other for problems. Builders blamed designers for changing specifications. Designers blamed builders for deviating from plans. Everyone blamed regulators for constantly tightening requirements. Some contractors were retained even after demonstrating incompetence. When work proved defective, the solution was often to fix it rather than find a more capable contractor. This tolerance for poor performance stemmed partly from the project's scale. Finding qualified nuclear contractors was difficult. Replacing a major contractor mid-project would cause additional delays. And then came 3 Mile Island. On March 28, 1979, a cooling system malfunction at the 3 Mile Island nuclear generating station in Pennsylvania caused a partial meltdown of the Unit 2 reactor core. The sequence of events began at 4 in the morning, when a minor malfunction in the secondary cooling system triggered a chain of failures that operators could not understand or control. Radioactive gases escaped into the atmosphere. Nearly 2 million people were exposed to small amounts of radiation. Governor Richard Thornburg ordered an evacuation of pregnant women and young children from the area. For 5 days, the nation watched in horror as engineers struggled to prevent a full catastrophe. Television cameras broadcast images of the reactor's distinctive cooling towers, which became symbols of nuclear anxiety. Parents kept children home from school. Families packed their cars and fled. The memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, buried for 30 years beneath optimistic promises of atoms for peace, suddenly resurfaced. The accident did not kill anyone. Independent studies found no measurable health effects on the surrounding population. The containment structure worked as designed, preventing a full-scale disaster, but the psychological impact was enormous. The nuclear industry's claim that serious accidents were essentially impossible had been proven false. If it could happen in Pennsylvania, it could happen anywhere. 3 Mile Island transformed American attitudes toward nuclear power. Public support dropped from 69% in 1977 to 46% in 1979. protests erupted across the country. 200,000 people marched in New York City. The anti-nuclear movement, which had been gaining strength throughout the decade, suddenly had its smoking gun. Musicians wrote songs about nuclear nightmares. Filmmakers produced cautionary tales. The release of The China Syndrome, a thriller about a nuclear plant cover-up, just 12 days before the accident, seemed almost prophetic. For WPPSS, the timing could not have been worse. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission responded to 3 Mile Island by imposing sweeping new safety requirements on all plants under construction. Design modifications that had been optional became mandatory. Equipment that had passed inspection now needed to be replaced. Construction that had been completed now needed to be redone. At Satsop, work that had been progressing steadily ground to a halt as engineers scrambled to incorporate the new regulations. Sections of the plant that had been finished were torn apart and rebuilt. The estimated completion date began to slip, first by months, then by years. The construction process revealed problems that would have been comical if the stakes had not been so high. The fast-track method was supposed to save time and money. Instead of completing designs before beginning construction, WPPSS started building while the engineering was still underway. The theory was that simultaneous design and construction would compress the schedule. The reality was chaos. Builders sometimes constructed components that designers had not yet specified. When the specifications arrived, they often conflicted with what had already been built. The solution was demolition and reconstruction, often multiple times. At one point, contractors installed a massive piece of equipment only to discover it was oriented incorrectly. Rather than admit the error and absorb the cost of reinstallation, they convinced WPPSS to modify the surrounding structures to accommodate the misplaced equipment. The modification cost more than reinstallation would have, but it allowed contractors to avoid acknowledging their mistake. A single pipe hanger, a simple bracket that secures pipes to walls, was built and rebuilt 17 times. The story became a symbol of deeper problems. Welds were defective, specifications were incorrect. Design changes made original installations obsolete. A component that should have cost a few $100s consumed tens of thousands in labor and materials. Quality control inspectors documented thousands of deficiencies, welds that failed inspection, concrete that did not meet specifications, electrical systems installed without proper testing. The problems accumulated faster than they could be corrected. One inspector later testified that his reports were routinely ignored. When he flagged issues that required immediate attention, managers told him to focus on other tasks. Contractors who had proven incompetent were retained for additional work. Builders often got ahead of designers, who then modified their drawings to conform to what had already been constructed rather than what had been planned. At one meeting in 1973, Seattle City Light Superintendent Gordon Vickery expressed surprise that the projects were already a year behind schedule. Nobody had told him. WPPSS had no experience building nuclear power plants. The directors and managers came from small-town utility districts. They understood how to maintain distribution lines and read meters. They did not understand how to coordinate thousands of contractors on the most complex construction projects ever attempted. The financial pressures mounted with each passing quarter. When construction began, interest rates were below 6%. By the early 1980s, as the Federal Reserve battled double-digit inflation, rates soared to nearly 15%. WPPSS was borrowing billions of dollars at costs that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. Every delay meant more borrowing. Every cost overrun meant more debt service. Every month of continued construction meant millions more in interest payments. The broader economic context made everything worse. The United States was experiencing the worst recession since the Great Depression. Unemployment reached nearly 11% nationally. In the Pacific Northwest, where the timber industry had already been declining, joblessness was even higher. Aluminum smelters, which had relocated to the region specifically because of cheap electricity, were shutting down. The demand growth that had justified the nuclear program was not merely failing to materialize, it was actually reversing. Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve was deliberately crushing the economy to break inflation. The medicine worked, eventually, but the side effects were devastating for anyone who had borrowed heavily in the expectation of continued prosperity. WPPSS had borrowed more heavily than almost any other public entity in America. The interest payments alone were consuming hundreds of millions of dollars annually, money that bought nothing except the right to continue borrowing. Bond analysts began asking uncomfortable questions. How could WPPSS possibly complete 5 nuclear plants when costs were escalating at 20% annually? How could utilities service debt on plants that might not operate for another decade? How could ratepayers afford electricity from reactors that would cost 3 or 4 times what had been projected? In May 1981, WPPSS revealed that the cost of all 5 plants had reached $23.9 billion. Plants 4 and 5 alone were now estimated at $11.8 billion, nearly 5 times the original projection. The electricity they were designed to produce would not be needed in the Pacific Northwest until well into the next century. The numbers had become absurd. Washington voters responded that November by passing Initiative 394, which required public agencies to obtain voter approval before issuing bonds for major energy projects. The measure was aimed directly at WPPSS. Supporters cited the cost escalation from $4.1 billion to $24 billion as evidence of out-of-control spending. Despite being outspent 7-1 by opponents, the initiative passed overwhelmingly. The voters wanted accountability. They wanted someone to ask permission before borrowing billions more. Governor John Spellman and Oregon Governor Victor Attier appointed a blue ribbon panel to evaluate the projects. The panel included United Airlines Chairman Edward Carlson, lumber magnate George Weyerhaeuser, and Oregon banker John Elorriaga. Their task was to determine whether continuing or abandoning the plants made more sense. The panel's deliberations highlighted the impossible choices facing policymakers. Continuing construction meant spending billions more with uncertain prospects for completion. Abandoning construction meant writing off billions already spent and defaulting on bonds. There was no good option. There was only a choice between bad and worse. Robert Ferguson arrived in 1980 with a mission to save the projects. Ferguson came from the Department of Energy, where he had experience with large-scale nuclear operations. He tried to impose discipline. He tightened controls on contract modifications. He demanded better coordination between designers and builders. But it was too late. The financial mathematics had become impossible. In August 1981, Ferguson persuaded the WPPSS board to order a 1-year slowdown on construction of plants 4 and 5. The slowdown did not solve the problem. It only delayed the inevitable. At Satsop, work continued on Plant 3, which was being treated as a showcase project. Under new management brought in by the contractor Ebasco, construction advanced at an estimated rate of 2% per month. The cooling towers were completed. The reactor building neared 75% completion. But Plant 5, the twin that was supposed to share costs and efficiencies, remained stuck at 16%. January 1982 marked the beginning of the end. The WPPSS board confronted the reality they had been avoiding. The total cost now exceeded $24 billion. Demand projections showed that the Pacific Northwest would not need the electricity for decades. The board voted to terminate construction on Plants 4 and 5. The decision was financially inevitable, but legally catastrophic. Those 88 utilities had signed take-or-pay contracts. They had promised to make payments whether the plants were finished or not. Now they owed $2.25 billion for reactors that would never generate a single watt of power. The utilities refused to pay. Customers were already furious about rate increases caused by the project. Now they were being asked to pay billions more for nothing at all. The political backlash was immediate and intense. Utility commissioners who had signed the contracts faced recall efforts. Ratepayers organized resistance campaigns. The utilities began looking for legal loopholes. If they could find some way to escape the contracts, they could avoid the payments. The money would come instead from the bondholders. The legal strategy that ultimately succeeded focused on the authority question. Under Washington state law, public utility districts had certain enumerated powers. They could generate electricity. They could distribute electricity. They could purchase electricity from other sources. But could they promise to pay for electricity that might never be produced? The take-or-pay contracts required utilities to pay their share of construction costs regardless of project completion. In effect, the utilities were guaranteeing loans for construction, not purchasing power. Was this within their legal authority? Different lawyers gave different opinions. When the contracts were signed, most legal advisors believed the commitments were valid. But as costs escalated and default loomed, some lawyers began questioning these assumptions. Perhaps the contracts exceeded the utilities' statutory authority. Perhaps they were ultra vires, beyond the legal power of the entities that signed them. In Oregon, the challenge succeeded. Judge Woodrich found that the participating utilities had lacked authority to enter into the take-or-pay agreements. The contracts were void from the beginning. Oregon ratepayers would not have to pay. In Washington, the state Supreme Court reached a similar conclusion on June 15, 1983, in Chemical Bank v. WPPSS. The court ruled 7-2 that Washington utilities had no authority to enter into agreements for the purchase of project capability. The contracts were also void. The decisions were controversial. Critics argued that the courts were finding technical excuses to allow utilities to escape commitments they had freely made. Supporters argued that the courts were correctly applying legal principles that protected ratepayers from unauthorized expenditures. Either way, the effect was catastrophic for bondholders. July 25, 1983, was the day the music stopped. Chemical Bank of New York, acting as trustee for the bondholders, had been trying for months to collect payment. They had demanded the overdue interest. They had received $25 million, essentially everything WPPSS had left. They had been told there was no more money. William Burroughs, a vice president at Chemical Bank, announced the default to the press. The Washington Public Power Supply System had admitted in writing that it could not pay its debts. The largest municipal bond default in American history was now official. $2.25 billion in face value. With interest, the total obligation exceeded $7 billion, and the bondholders would recover only a fraction of that amount. The default sent shockwaves through the municipal bond market. Investors who had purchased WPPSS bonds, believing them to be safe, suddenly discovered they were holding worthless paper. Insurance companies, pension funds, individual retirees who had put their savings into what they thought were secure investments. The human toll was immediate and widespread. The political response was swift and angry. Representative John Dingell of Michigan, chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, launched an investigation that would produce thousands of pages of testimony and documents. Dingell, known for his aggressive oversight, demanded to know how regulators had allowed this disaster to unfold. How had the Securities and Exchange Commission permitted bonds to be sold without adequate disclosure of the risks? How had rating agencies assigned their highest ratings to securities that turned out to be worthless? The congressional hearings painted a damning picture. Witnesses described a project that had been troubled from the beginning, with problems systematically hidden from investors and the public. Internal documents showed that managers had known about cost overruns and schedule delays long before they were disclosed. Marketing materials had emphasized the security of the investments while downplaying the risks. Representative Al Swift of Washington, whose district included Satsop, faced the impossible task of defending his constituents while acknowledging the failures. The workers who had built the plants were his voters. The bondholders who had lost their savings were also Americans who deserved protection. There were no easy answers, no simple villains, no satisfying resolutions. In Grays Harbor County, the impact was personal. Local residents had not only worked on the construction sites, they had invested their own money in WPPSS bonds. The Girl Scouts of Olympia had put their entire treasury into the bonds because municipal debt was considered safe. Small-town retirement accounts had been built around the promised interest payments. Church building funds, college savings accounts, emergency reserves that families had accumulated over decades. The local newspapers filled with stories of loss. A retired teacher who had invested her pension supplement. A small business owner who had put the proceeds from selling his store into what he thought was a secure income stream. A young couple who had purchased bonds as their first investment, hoping to build a nest egg for their children's education. The irony was bitter. These people had believed in the project. They had watched the towers rise from the hillsides. They had known workers who showed up every day to pour concrete and weld pipes. They had trusted that their neighbors and their government would not have embarked on a project that was doomed to fail. One woman described losing her entire retirement savings. She had purchased the bonds on the advice of her broker, who assured her they were backed by the full faith and credit of nearly 90 public utilities. She had believed him. She had trusted the ratings agencies. She had done everything right, and she lost everything anyway. Her story was repeated thousands of times across the region and across the country. The workers suffered too. When construction stopped, more than 5,000 employees at Satsop alone lost their jobs. Many had relocated to Grays Harbor specifically for this work. They had bought houses, enrolled their children in schools, joined churches and civic organizations. Now they faced the prospect of starting over somewhere else, with skills that were suddenly worthless in a nuclear industry that was no longer building anything. At Satsop, construction halted, but the structures remained. Plant 3 was 76% complete when the money ran out. The reactor vessel had been installed. The cooling tower stood finished. The turbine building stretched 300,000 square feet across the hillside. The site fell silent almost overnight. One day, thousands of workers were pouring concrete and welding pipes. The next, the access roads were empty. Tools were left where they had been dropped. Half-completed installations waited for attention that would never come. Security guards patrolled structures that would never operate, protecting equipment that would never be used. The abandonment created its own problems. Nuclear construction sites are not designed to be left incomplete. Systems that were meant to work together were frozen in various stages of installation. Pipes that were supposed to carry coolant stopped mid-run. Electrical conduits ended in junction boxes connected to nothing. The careful sequencing that nuclear construction requires, each step building on the last, each system designed to integrate with others, had been interrupted at random points throughout the facility. Weatherproofing became an immediate concern. Structures that were designed to be enclosed were left open to the Pacific Northwest rain. Water seeped into electrical systems. Rust began its slow work on exposed steel. The humid climate that made the region so green also accelerated the decay of abandoned infrastructure. But there was no fuel. No uranium had ever been loaded into the reactor core. The plant had never generated a single neutron of fission energy. All that concrete and steel and copper wiring represented nothing more than the world's most expensive abandoned construction project. Plant 5 was worse. Only 16% complete, it looked like a skeleton. The cooling tower stood empty, a hollow shell without the internal structures that would have distributed cooling water. The reactor building had no roof, just steel rebar fingers reaching skyward, waiting for concrete that would never come. Wide-open doorways and holes intended for coolant pipes gave the structure the appearance of a ruin, though it had never been anything else. The aftermath unfolded in courtrooms across the country. The WPPSS litigation became the largest civil case in American legal history. Over 5 years of pretrial preparation, it generated an estimated 200 million document pages. 300 people involved in selling the bonds gave depositions over 2 years. Another 285 fact witnesses testified. 34 expert witnesses offered opinions. The trial itself began in September 1988 in federal court in Tucson, Arizona. It was expected to last anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. Some called it the mother of all lawsuits. Before the trial could reach a verdict, settlements began. WPPSS itself, having essentially no money to pay, agreed to a deal that acknowledged its obligation to pay the full face value and interest, approximately $3 billion, while conceding there was no expectation that money would ever materialize. The real targets were the engineering firms, financial advisors, and underwriters. Merrill Lynch, Smith Barney, Salomon Brothers, Botch, the Securities and Exchange Commission investigated. They found that institutional investors and brokerage firms had dumped the bonds on the public after becoming aware of problems at the construction sites. The professionals had gotten out while ordinary investors were still buying. The SEC staff report identified deficiencies in disclosure but declined to bring enforcement action. The commission questioned whether it had sufficient resources to pursue the matter and noted the difficulty of assigning responsibility when so many parties had contributed to the failure. On Christmas Eve 1988, the major parties reached a settlement of $753 million. Additional settlements followed over the next several years. By 1995, total recoveries approached $800 million. The bondholders who had invested $2.25 billion received back somewhere between 10 and 40 cents on the dollar. The rest was simply gone. The settlements that resolved the litigation provided partial compensation to bondholders, but left many questions unanswered. The message seemed to be that everyone was at fault, which meant that nobody was specifically accountable. The failure was systemic, not individual. The causes were diffuse, not concentrated. This conclusion may have been legally accurate, but emotionally unsatisfying. Bondholders who lost their savings wanted someone to blame. They wanted accountability. They wanted justice. What they received was settlements that returned a fraction of what they had been promised. The damage extended far beyond the bondholders. Bonneville Power Administration rates increased dramatically to cover the cost of the net-billed plants. Customers across the Pacific Northwest saw their electricity bills rise. In some small towns, where unemployment from the recession was already high, the burden fell hardest on those least able to bear it. Some customers faced obligations equivalent to more than $12,000 per household for projects that produced nothing. WPPSS itself survived, though barely. They changed their name to Energy Northwest in 1998, hoping to escape the stigma of the Whoops nickname that the press had applied so gleefully. The rebranding cost ratepayers more than $260,000, including $140,000 to devise the new name and another $123,000 to settle a lawsuit from another organization already using it. Of the 5 plants they had attempted to build, only one ever operated. Plant 2 at Hanford, later renamed Columbia Generating Station, came online in 1984 and continues producing electricity to this day. It generates about 12% of the power supplied by Bonneville Power Administration and operates at a cost of about 2 cents per kilowatt-hour. Plants 1 and 3 were mothballed, their costs absorbed by the federal government through Bonneville. Their incomplete structures were eventually dismantled. Plants 4 and 5 were simply abandoned. The Bonneville Power Administration played a crucial role in the WPPSS story, though its involvement remains controversial. Created in 1937 to market electricity from federal dams, Bonneville became the dominant power provider in the Pacific Northwest, selling cheap hydroelectric energy to public utilities, industries, and consumers across the region. By the 1960s, Bonneville planners saw trouble ahead. Demand was growing faster than new dams could be built. Environmental concerns were blocking additional hydroelectric development. The agency needed new sources of generation to meet future needs. Nuclear power seemed like the answer. Bonneville could not build nuclear plants itself, but it could facilitate their construction by others. The net billing arrangement that financed WPPSS plants 1, 2, and 3 essentially made the federal agency the guarantor of the debt. This arrangement served Bonneville's interests. The agency would receive the electricity produced by the plants without having to navigate the regulatory complexities of nuclear construction. But the arrangement also created problems. Bonneville was not directly supervising the construction. The agency relied on WPPSS to manage the projects competently. When management failures became apparent, Bonneville had limited ability to intervene. Critics later argued that Bonneville should have exercised more oversight. The agency knew that costs were escalating and schedules were slipping. It could have insisted on management changes. It could have threatened to withdraw support. Bonneville officials responded that they had limited authority over an independent municipal corporation. They could advise, but not direct. The relationship was cooperative, not supervisory. Bonneville ultimately absorbed losses on plants 1 and 3 through its rate structure, spreading the cost across the entire Pacific Northwest. The regional planning apparatus that justified the 5-reactor program deserves scrutiny. In the 1960s and 1970s, energy forecasting was more art than science. Analysts projected future demand by extrapolating historical trends, then added safety margins to account for uncertainty. The results consistently showed demand growing faster than supply. The hydrothermal power plant, developed in the early 1970s, called for massive new generating capacity. It assumed demand growth of 7% annually, doubling every 10 years. This assumption proved wildly optimistic. The 1973 oil crisis changed consumption patterns. Conservation programs reduced per capita demand. Economic restructuring shifted the region away from energy-intensive industries. Actual growth fell far below projections. By the time the forecasts were proven wrong, billions had already been committed to construction. The plants were being built to meet demand that would never materialize. Some analysts warned about the forecasting errors early on. Seattle City Light's Energy 1990 study, completed in the mid-1970s, recommended conservation over nuclear construction. The study concluded that demand could be managed through efficiency improvements and rate structures that encouraged responsible consumption. Seattle City Council heeded the study and voted against participating in Plants 4 and 5. The decision was controversial at the time. Critics accused the council of short-sighted parochialism, of failing to contribute to regional energy security. In retrospect, Seattle made the right call. The city avoided billions in losses. Its ratepayers were spared the burden of paying for plants that would never operate. The conservation programs that Seattle pioneered became models for the entire region. The financing innovations that made WPPSS possible also made its collapse catastrophic. The take-or-pay contracts seemed like a reasonable solution to a genuine problem. How do you finance a 20-year construction project when no revenue will flow until completion? You find creditworthy entities willing to guarantee payment regardless of outcome. You transfer the risk from bondholders to ratepayers. You create securities that rating agencies will mark as investment grade. The problem was that the creditworthy entities were not actually creditworthy enough to bear the risks they assumed. Small-town utility districts with limited budgets and no experience in nuclear construction signed contracts obligating them to pay billions for power they might never receive. When the courts ruled these contracts void, they were essentially acknowledging that the original premise had been flawed. The utilities had never had the authority to make such commitments. The elaborate financial structure had been built on a foundation of sand. The bondholders paid the price. They had trusted the ratings. They had believed the assurances. They had purchased securities marketed as safe investments, backed by the full faith and credit of nearly 90 public entities. They lost billions. The lesson was clear, though not everyone learned it. Complex financial engineering can obscure fundamental risks. AAA ratings do not guarantee safety. When something seems too good to be true, it usually is. The participating utilities ranged from large municipal systems to tiny rural cooperatives serving a few thousand customers. For the large utilities, participation in WPPSS seemed like a reasonable way to secure future power supplies. They had legal departments that reviewed the contracts. They had boards that understood the commitments being made. They made informed decisions based on the best available information. For the small utilities, the situation was dire. Many lacked the expertise to evaluate complex nuclear construction projects. Many relied on regional planning bodies to advise them on energy needs. Many signed contracts they did not fully understand. When costs escalated, some found themselves facing obligations that exceeded their entire annual budgets. A rural electric cooperative serving 5,000 customers might owe millions of dollars for a project it had never inspected, designed by engineers it had never met, built by contractors it had never chosen. The take-or-pay obligation seemed abstract when the plants were under construction and completion seemed likely. It became terrifyingly concrete when construction stopped and the bills came due. Local ratepayers who had been told nuclear power would lower their electricity costs discovered that they would be paying for years, perhaps decades, to service debt on plants that would never generate a single watt. The anger was immediate and intense. Utility commissioners who had authorized participation faced recall efforts. Public meetings became shouting matches. The social fabric of small communities was torn by accusations of incompetence and betrayal. The bondholders were not sophisticated institutions seeking high-risk investments. Many were individuals who had been told that municipal bonds were among the safest investments available. The interest was tax-free. The principal was secure. The ratings agencies had assigned OLE ratings indicating virtually no risk of default. Financial advisors recommended WPPSS bonds to retirees seeking stable income. Estate planners included them in conservative portfolios. Small-town banks purchased them for their own accounts. The role of the rating agencies would later come under intense scrutiny. Moody's and Standard & Poor's had assigned their highest ratings to the WPPSS bonds, the same ratings given to U.S. Treasury securities. These ratings were supposed to reflect careful analysis of the borrower's ability to repay. They were supposed to warn investors when risks were elevated. Instead, the rating agencies had relied on the same assumptions that had seduced everyone else. 88 utilities could not all default simultaneously. Take-or-pay contracts provided ironclad security. The Pacific Northwest needed electricity, and nuclear power would provide it. The ratings reflected faith in a system rather than analysis of actual risks. When the default came, the rating agencies faced accusations of negligence. How could securities rated AAA become worthless? What was the point of ratings if they provided no warning of impending collapse? The agencies defended themselves by arguing that their ratings reflected credit quality at the time of issuance, not predictions of future performance. The legal nuances mattered little to investors who had trusted the ratings and lost their savings. When the default came, these investors discovered that AAA ratings were not guarantees. That tax-free interest meant nothing when the principal disappeared, that safe investments could become worthless overnight. The individual stories were heartbreaking. Widows who had invested their husband's life insurance proceeds, teachers who had saved for decades to supplement meager pensions, small business owners who had trusted their broker's recommendations. Some investors had purchased WPPSS bonds because they believed in the project. They wanted the Pacific Northwest to have abundant clean energy. They saw nuclear power as the future and wanted to be part of it. Their idealism was rewarded with financial ruin. The institutional investors were better positioned to absorb the losses. Insurance companies and pension funds had diversified portfolios that could withstand the hit. Individual bondholders had no such buffer. The media coverage established narratives that persist to this day. The nickname WHOOPS captured the public imagination immediately. The coincidence of the agency's acronym with an expression of error was too perfect to resist. Journalists used the term constantly, reinforcing the perception that the project was fundamentally incompetent. Stories about mismanagement became symbols of broader failures. Television news featured images of the massive cooling towers, empty and purposeless, rising from the forested hillside. The visual contrast between the scale of construction and the absence of activity conveyed failure more powerfully than any financial analysis. Print journalists produced detailed investigations of management failures, regulatory breakdowns, and financial manipulations. The Seattle Times, the Oregonian, and other regional papers devoted extensive resources to understanding what had gone wrong. National media picked up the story as it became the largest municipal bond default in American history. The Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post all covered the collapse. The coverage was largely critical. Journalists had difficulty finding defenders of the project willing to speak on the record. The people who had made the decisions that led to failure were understandably reluctant to accept responsibility publicly. But there was some truth to the defenders' claims. The challenges were real. Inflation, interest rates, and regulatory changes would have stressed any nuclear construction project. The managers who failed were not villains, but people overwhelmed by circumstances. Yet the fundamental problem was organizational. WPPSS had no system for managing complexity on this scale. Every decision required coordination among dozens of contractors, consultants, and regulatory bodies. Every change rippled through schedules and budgets in ways that nobody fully understood. They were learning on the job while spending billions of dollars that they did not have. Understanding what happened at Satsop requires understanding the broader context of American nuclear power. The 1970s was supposed to be the decade when nuclear energy came into its own. Dozens of reactors were under construction across the country. The technology had been proven. The economics seemed favorable. The environmental benefits were clear, but a series of factors combined to derail the nuclear renaissance. The optimism of the early atomic age had been extraordinary. In the 1950s, promoters had promised that nuclear electricity would be too cheap to meter. Homes would be heated by atomic furnaces. Ships and planes would be powered by miniature reactors. The same technology that had ended World War II would usher in an era of limitless abundance. Reality proved more complicated. Nuclear plants were extraordinarily complex, requiring precision engineering on a scale that few industries had ever attempted. The fuel cycle involved radioactive materials that remained dangerous for thousands of years. The potential consequences of a serious accident were catastrophic enough to justify extensive safety measures that added billions to construction costs. The industry had also made promises it could not keep. Cost estimates proved wildly optimistic. Construction schedules proved wildly unrealistic. Plants that were supposed to take 5 years to build took 10 or 15. Plants that were supposed to cost hundreds of millions ended up costing billions. The gap between promotional claims and operational reality grew wider with each passing year. Costs were the primary killer. Nuclear plants that were supposed to cost hundreds of millions ended up costing billions. Construction time stretched from years to decades. Interest payments accumulated faster than concrete could cure. Some of this was caused by inflation and high interest rates, forces beyond the control of any individual project. But much of it was caused by the fundamental challenge of building something so complex that small errors cascaded into enormous problems. Nuclear plants are not like other industrial facilities. Every component must function perfectly because the consequences of failure are catastrophic. This requirement means constant inspection, constant testing, constant revision. When problems are discovered, they must be fixed, even if the fix requires tearing apart work that has already been completed. The regulatory environment made this worse. After 3 Mile Island, requirements tightened significantly. Plants designed under one set of rules suddenly had to meet a different set. The changes were justified by safety concerns, but they added billions in costs to projects that were already struggling. WPPSS was not unique in facing these challenges. Nuclear projects across the country encountered similar problems. The Shoreham plant on Long Island was completed but never operated because of evacuation concerns. The Zimmer plant in Ohio was converted to coal after construction problems made nuclear operation impractical. The Marble Hill plant in Indiana was abandoned when it was more than half complete. 52 reactors were canceled between 1980 and 1984. The industry that was supposed to transform American energy ended up retreating into a handful of successful plants surrounded by abandoned construction sites. Satsop was simply the largest and most spectacular failure. The legacy of WPPSS shaped energy policy in the Pacific Northwest for decades. The debacle left the region with what one commentator called a distaste for nuclear power. Proposals for new reactors faced immediate opposition. The memories of cost overruns and broken promises were too fresh, too painful. The WPPSS collapse also influenced national energy policy. Congressional investigations led to reforms in how municipal bonds were marketed and rated. The Securities and Exchange Commission tightened disclosure requirements for complex infrastructure projects. State legislatures across the country passed laws requiring greater oversight of utility investments. More broadly, the failure contributed to a generation-long pause in American nuclear construction. Not a single new nuclear plant was ordered in the United States between 1978 and 2012. The industry that had once promised to transform American energy found itself fighting simply to keep existing plants operating. The vision of an atomic-powered future faded into memory. When Energy Northwest, the renamed WPPSS, proposed building new modular reactors at Hanford in recent years, skeptics pointed to the historical record. They reminded officials that the same organization had once promised cheap electricity and delivered the largest municipal bond default in American history. The name had changed, but the institutional memory persisted. The region chose a different path. Conservation programs reduced demand growth below what the 1970s forecasters had predicted. Washington utilities pioneered demand-side management, paying customers to reduce consumption rather than building new generation to meet it. Wind farms sprouted on the Columbia Plateau, their turbines spinning in the same winds that had once powered sailing ships up the river. Solar installations provided new sources of generation. Natural gas plants filled gaps when renewable output fluctuated. The electricity crisis that WPPSS had been created to prevent never materialized. The demand that was supposed to double every 10 years grew more slowly than anticipated. The apocalyptic shortage that had justified 5 nuclear plants never came. In retrospect, The forecasts that drove the entire enterprise were wrong. The planners who saw an energy crisis looming were working with models that overstated growth and understated conservation potential. They built monuments to a future that existed only in their projections. But history does not stand still. Today, the Pacific Northwest faces energy challenges that echo those of the 1970s. Data centers consume enormous amounts of electricity, their servers humming day and night to power the digital economy. Electric vehicle adoption increases demand. Climate change makes hydropower less reliable as snowpack patterns shift and droughts become more frequent. The aluminum smelters may be gone, but new industries have emerged that are equally hungry for power. Some are calling for a nuclear renaissance. Energy Northwest itself is pursuing plans to build up to 12 small modular reactors at Hanford. The designs are different from the massive plants of the WPPSS era, smaller, supposedly simpler, manufactured in factories rather than constructed on site. Proponents argue that the technology has matured, that the mistakes of the past need not be repeated. The advocates argue that lessons have been learned. Modular designs reduce complexity. Factory construction eliminates on-site chaos. Standardization prevents the custom engineering that caused costs to spiral. The new reactors would be built one at a time, with each one demonstrating success before the next is started. No more betting everything on 5 simultaneous projects. The skeptics are not convinced. They remember the management failures. They remember the forecasts that were wrong and the contracts that were void. They remember the billions that were lost and the lives that were disrupted. They ask whether the fundamental problems of nuclear construction, its expense, its complexity, its regulatory uncertainty, have really been solved or merely deferred. Nuclear power remains controversial, and Satsop remains part of the reason. When proponents argue for new nuclear construction, opponents point to WPPSS as evidence that nuclear projects inevitably exceed budgets and schedules. The cooling towers standing in the forests of Grays Harbor County are not just monuments to past failure. They are warnings for the future. Whether the new nuclear projects succeed or fail, they will build on the foundation of what happened at Satsop. The physical legacy continues to evolve. In 1999, ownership of the site was transferred to the Satsop redevelopment project. A local authority determined to find some use for the billions of dollars in infrastructure that had been abandoned. The original plan called for a business park, a way to turn a fiasco into an opportunity. Washington state law required that abandoned nuclear projects be dismantled. The estimated cost of demolition was $100 million. Nobody wanted to pay it. So the towers stayed. The Grays Harbor Public Development Authority took control of the site in the late 1990s. The transformation into a business park proceeded slowly. Finding tenants willing to operate in facilities designed for nuclear power required creativity and persistence. The buildings were overbuilt for most commercial purposes, with concrete walls thick enough to withstand catastrophic accidents. Eventually, clients appeared. Call centers appreciated the isolation and the reliable power supply. Manufacturers valued the large indoor spaces. Today, the Satsop Business Park covers 1,700 acres and hosts about 50 tenants. The Port of Grays Harbor now manages the site, marketing it for commercial use, film production, and tourism. Walking tours allow visitors to experience the abandoned nuclear facilities. The cooling towers have become landmarks, visible for miles, drawing curious travelers who want to see what billions of dollars in failed ambition look like. A former NASA scientist named Ron Sorrow established an acoustics testing laboratory in the reactor building. Because the structure was designed to withstand a nuclear blast and a magnitude 10 earthquake, it is one of the quietest places on Earth. The walls are nearly 10 feet thick. External sound cannot penetrate. He tests loudspeakers there, measuring frequencies that would be impossible to isolate anywhere else. These are the uses that have been found for buildings designed to contain atomic fire. The Transformers films that use Satsop as a location introduced the site to millions of viewers worldwide. Most did not know the history. They saw only spectacular visuals of giant robots battling amid concrete monuments. The post-apocalyptic aesthetic that resulted from failure served perfectly to depict fictional catastrophe. The story of Satsop is not a simple tale of villainy and victims. There were no evil masterminds plotting to defraud investors. There were well-meaning officials who believed they were securing the energy future of their region. There were engineers who spent years solving complex technical problems, ensuring that the reactors would operate safely and efficiently. Their work was sound. The systems they designed would have functioned as intended, but their designs were never tested in operation. Their calculations were never validated by actual performance. There were workers who showed up every day, poured concrete, welded pipes, and took pride in their craftsmanship even as management chaos swirled around them. The failure came not from malice, but from overconfidence. From managers who took on responsibilities they did not understand. From financiers who structured deals without considering what would happen if things went wrong. From regulators who changed requirements without accounting for the costs. From forecasters who predicted futures that never arrived. There were limits to what planners could predict. The forecasts that justified 5 nuclear plants were wrong by orders of magnitude. The energy crisis that was supposed to arrive never materialized. There were limits to what managers could control. The complexity of nuclear construction exceeded the capabilities of organizations that had never attempted anything similar. There were limits to what markets could finance. The take-or-pay contracts that seemed so clever collapsed when tested against reality. There were limits to what technology could deliver. Nuclear power, which promised electricity too cheap to meter, ended up costing more than any alternative. And there were limits to what society could absorb. The workers who built Satsop did not cause the project's failure. When construction stopped, they lost their jobs. Some found work elsewhere in the nuclear industry. Others retrained for different careers. Many never recovered economically from the sudden termination. The engineers who designed the plant believed in what they were creating. Their careers were defined by a project that consumed their best years and produced nothing. The contrast between aspiration and outcome could not be more stark. WPPSS planned to build 5 nuclear reactors, producing more than 6,000 megawatts of carbon-free electricity. They would power the Pacific Northwest for generations. What they actually built was 1 operating reactor and 4 abandoned construction sites. The plan seemed reasonable at the time. The demand forecasts were based on historical trends. The cost estimates were based on industry experience, but the plans collided with reality. The collision destroyed wealth, careers, communities. The final irony is that the plant that destroyed so many lives and fortunes was never dangerous. No radiation ever escaped from Satsop because no radioactive materials were ever present. No meltdown occurred because no reactor ever operated. All the concrete and steel designed to contain atomic fire contained only air. All the safety systems engineered to prevent catastrophe prevented nothing because nothing ever happened. The catastrophe was purely financial. The meltdown was fiscal, not nuclear. The contamination spread through bank accounts, not groundwater. In some ways, this makes the story more tragic, not less. If a reactor had actually failed, if radiation had actually escaped, at least the structures would have served their purpose. The containment would have contained. The systems would have functioned. Instead, the most expensive safety measures ever constructed protected against a danger that never existed because the project collapsed before the danger could materialize. Time continues its work on the abandoned structures. Water seeps through concrete designed to be impermeable. Vegetation grows in spaces meant for machinery. Steel rusts in the damp Pacific Northwest climate. The decay is slow but inexorable. The buildings were designed to last for decades of nuclear operation. They are instead enduring decades of abandonment. The reactor building at WNP3 is perhaps the most haunting space on the site. The main circular chamber is 280 feet tall and 160 feet across. A 250-ton overhead crane still hangs from the ceiling, waiting to move equipment that was never installed. The reactor vessel was placed here, but never fueled. No uranium ever entered this building. No fission ever occurred. The space remains free of radiation, a distinction that makes it unique among abandoned nuclear facilities. Foliage has begun growing up through flooded sections of the floor. Water seeps through cracks in the concrete. Nature is slowly reclaiming what ambition briefly seized. Visitors who obtain permission to enter describe the experience as otherworldly. The scale is difficult to comprehend. The silence is absolute. The sense of interrupted purpose is overwhelming. Stand inside Cooling Tower 3 today, and you can feel the weight of that failure. The space is vast beyond comprehension. 496 feet of concrete stretching toward a circle of sky. The walls curve inward as they rise, creating the distinctive hyperbolic shape that nuclear plants made famous. Make a sound, and it echoes for seconds, bouncing off the concrete, reverberating through a chamber designed to handle the roar of rising steam. The floor is grass now. Seeds blew in after the construction stopped. Rain fell through the opening at the top. Life found a way into this monument to human ambition. Musicians come here to record because the sound is like nothing else on Earth. Video game designers come to capture the atmosphere of industrial abandonment. The towers will stand for a long time yet. Tearing them down would cost millions, perhaps tens of millions. The reinforced concrete was designed to withstand forces that demolition crews rarely encounter. So they remain. Monuments to a future that never arrived. Warnings about the dangers of overreach. The cooling towers will outlast everyone who remembers what they were supposed to become. They will stand while the last workers who poured their concrete pass away. They will stand while the last investors who lost money in the default fade from memory. Future visitors may not know about WPPSS or bond defaults or take-or-pay contracts. They may see only strange towers rising from the forest, monuments to some forgotten purpose. But the towers will still testify. They will still speak in their silent way about the gap between human ambition and human achievement, about the price of failure when the stakes are measured in billions. They spent billions on a nuclear plant. They never turned it on.